Hello and welcome to the Starting Thousand Suns series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list, and everything in between for the forces of the Thousand Suns army. In this video we'll be taking a look at some of the special rules for the Thousand Suns to see if you would enjoy playing them based on some of the army-wide special rules for the Thousand Suns to give you an idea of how they play and how they can perform on the tabletop, and what separates them from other Chaos forces when playing. And to begin with, if you're not familiar with the Thousand Suns are the psykers and sorcerers of the Chaos Space Marine Legions. As such, they are the army or the subfaction that will have the most interaction with the different psychic powers that Chaos bring to the table. Well, what does that mean? Outside of the different relic stratagems and warlord traits that might interact with psychic powers, they have a lot of special abilities that do interact with the different psychic powers that they have access to, which they have quite a few of. And they have even more special powers in some of their units that resemble psychic powers as well. Now let's take a look at what you get for being a Thousand Suns army. To begin with, the simplest rule is the Brotherhood of Sorcerers ability that all Thousand Sun units within a Thousand Suns detachment gain. The first benefit of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers is that you add 1 to the psychic test taken for any units with this keyword. In addition to that, Arcane Astartes units as well as Bray units gain a 5+ invulnerable save. This can actually make some of your units deceptively tanky, as all of a sudden they have a very respectable invulnerable save for your basic Marines, and they already feature 2 wounds per model. This means that the Thousand Sun Space Marines are a little bit more durable, and that actually goes quite a long way, considering they can pack quite a good amount of firepower, and in addition to that, their aspiring sorcerers have access to psychic powers as well, giving you quite a lot of unique gameplay that other armies don't have access to. Now, outside of that generic ability, the Thousand Suns do have some special rules that interact with different psychic powers. The first of these rules is a rule like many other armies have, that if you take a pure Thousand Suns army, you gain access to some special benefits that you would otherwise lose. The special benefit for the Thousand Suns is the Cabalistic rituals. And the Cabalistic rituals are a very unique set of rules that benefit you for having different models on the table. What Cabalistic Rituals does is, at the beginning of your psychic phase, you gain a set number of points based on the models you have living on the table. And you gain the following points for the following models. You gain 4 points for having Magnus the Red on the table. You gain 3 points for Ahriman the Exalted Sorcerer or a Chaos Demon Prince. You gain 2 points for each Sorcerer or Sorcerer and Terminator armor, as well as Infernal Masters. And then you gain 1 point for each Scarab Occult Sorcerer and Aspiring Sorcerer, as well as Brave Shaman. This means that the Thousand Suns will generally prefer a MSU style of play, as having many small units on the tabletop does benefit you because each of those Thousand Suns Space Marine units or Scarab Occult Terminator units will have a Scarab Occult Terminator or Aspiring Sorcerer within them, thus generating you 1 Cabal point per unit. However, do keep in mind that these points are generated for living units, so there is a little bit of a balance in that once that unit gets removed, you're no longer generating those Cabal points. In addition to that, do remember that it's important to take note when building your list in terms of how many points you can realistically generate within any given phase and have some idea of how those points will decay over the course of the game. As the more units you lose, the more likely you are going to have a lack of points to spend, and if you have weird breakpoints, there will come situations where you don't have enough points to activate all of the abilities you want. This ability actually makes it very unique in terms of how the Thousand Suns play, as all of a sudden you're taking into consideration how this ability works in terms of list building, in terms of how your units survive on the table, and how you can spend your points most efficiently based on the abilities you have access to. And as such, there's no one right way to play this ability, as it's going to be case specific based on the game state at the time and your opponent as well as your army in specific. This makes it a very complex and interesting ability, but one that can be rather hard to master, especially for newer players. So what can you spend these Cabal points on? Well, you can spend these Cabal points on different abilities, and you can only use each of these abilities once per turn and once per psyker. The Cabal points also don't carry over from each turn, so they are depleted at the end of their turn, so you only have a set limited amount to use in every psychic phase, and you cannot pull these points up like you could with some other abilities in some other armies. Now let's take a look at what the different benefits you can gain by spending your points. The first of these benefits I would say are the ones that help you pass your different psychic tests. For 9 Cabal points, you can gain +2 to your psychic test, and for 5 Cabal points, you can gain +1, and this applies to the unit making that psychic check. In addition to that, this happens after you take the psychic test, so you do have a little bit of leeway on that end. However, you cannot wait until after your opponent rolls a Deny the Witch test in order to counteract their Deny the Witch, So you do have to make the decision of whether or not you're going to use your Cabal points for one of these two benefits before your opponent makes their deny check. On the other hand, if you're looking for the ability to automatically pass one of your psychic checks, you can spend 7 points to auto-pass one of your checks with the minimum warp charge value. In a lot of cases, this can be better than spending 9 points on one of your psychic abilities, though you can use these in different situations for different reasons. Do remember that it is easier to potentially deny you when using the 7-point ability to automatically pass with the minimum value than it would be when you're using 9 points to get +2 to your psychic test. Inversely, there are going to be situations where the 7-point ability is going to be significantly better than the 9-point ability. It really just comes down to the matchup, and in some cases, it will just depend on whether or not you're playing against an opponent who can easily deny you. In addition to that, in some cases, opponents may have a stratagem that can allow them to deny your psychic check on a 4+, so in many cases in that situation, the 7-point ability is better than the 9-point ability because it doesn't actually affect your opponent's ability to deny you. Now that being said, in other cases, such as the psychic ability of using Smite, which does scale incrementally in terms of the required minimum warp value charge, there is a lot of benefit to the 7-point ability as well, as it can scale with that Smite ability much more significantly than the 9-point ability can. So just because one ability costs more points does not mean it's specifically better than another ability. Now, one other option that can help you to force through some of your psychic powers is an 8-point ability that allows you to make one of your powers undeniable when you spend the 8 points on this Cabalistic ritual. This is actually an interesting ability, and once again, really depends on what army you're playing against, as some armies can have a very easy time of denying your psychic abilities, while other armies may have no ability to deny you, so this will be a dead ability in those situations. This is definitely one of the more boom-bust abilities that really does come down to a matchup, and it is very expensive, but if there is a critical psychic power that you need, it's definitely a decent go-to. There is one other high-cost option within the Cabalistic rituals that is a little bit interesting. This ability allows you to manifest a Witchfire spell that another unit already attempted to manifest in this phase. This is allowed even if it's a once per turn ability, and even if the unit chosen to cast that ability does not actually know that psychic power. This Cabalistic ritual actually has a few different implications, as all of a sudden you can surprise an opponent with a psychic power they're not expecting, and you can also double cast one of your stronger psychic powers. This is definitely an interesting Cabalistic ritual, and it's one to definitely keep in mind, as it gives you a lot of versatility that your units might not otherwise have in certain situations when this becomes applicable, but do keep in mind that it is also very expensive at 8 Cabalistic points. And do remember that these expensive abilities are a bit difficult to use at times, because even if you have 5 units of Chaos Space Marines, 2 units of Scarab Terminators, and something like an Exalted Sorcerer, you're going to struggle very heavily to use 2 of these abilities within one turn. In addition to that, once your army starts to deplete some of its units, you're going to have a harder and harder time using your psychic powers. So the ability to cast the more expensive ones is definitely going to be more prominent within the earlier turns of the game. Now after these Cabalistic rituals, there's a few different ones that are a little less expensive, and these are going to be the ones that you're going to make a lot of use of, considering your Cabalistic ritual limitations. There are 3 different 4-point abilities. The first of these gives you the ability to add 6 inches to one of your spells, and that's a decent amount of utility, though it isn't necessarily the best thing in the world, considering you're spending 4 of your precious Cabalistic points to just get those 6 inches. There's another Cabalistic ritual you can spend 4 points on that allows you to perform an action that gains you a command point once that action is performed, which is a decent enough way to pick up a command point if you have a unit that isn't going to be doing much and you don't mind it performing an action for that turn. This isn't necessarily a bad ability, considering you are going to be trending towards that MSU style of play, so you are going to have some units that could potentially perform an action and restore some of your command points. Though interestingly enough, as we'll see in the future, Thousand Suns does not actually have as much difficulty with command points like some armies would, as they have a few different ways of regaining them or gaining abilities that other armies would spend their command points on. And finally, the last of the 4-point Cabalistic rituals, and the one that I think is probably going to be the most useful, is the one that allows it to deal an additional D3 mortal wounds with a power that deals mortal wounds to a target. This is good for obvious reasons, as for 4 points you can generate D3 mortal wounds, and oftentimes something like this would cost you command points within other armies, or would be a lot harder to generate. This is definitely an impressive ability considering the low Cabalistic point cost of this Cabalistic ritual. There's definitely going to be one that you're going to be looking out for when playing the Thousand Suns. There is also one additional Cabalistic ritual which only costs 3 points and will be a good filler option when you end up with an odd amount of Cabalistic ritual points and you want to eat up the last few points without letting them go to waste. This Cabbalistic ritual also gives you a decent amount of utility, considering that it says you can target a unit not visible to the caster, but visible to another unit within your army that has Cabbalistic rituals as an ability. This means you have a lot of versatility to position your different units, allowing you to potentially use a stronger psychic power to target a unit that you might not otherwise be able to target. In addition to that, the ability to ignore line of sight is incredibly powerful within the 9th edition rule set, especially when you consider how big of a role terrain plays within the game at this current time. And this is actually very interesting considering the low cost of this Cabalistic ritual, and it's going to be one that you're going to find a decent amount of use for, not only because of the utility that it offers, but also because of the low points cost that it has as well, giving you a lot of ability to kind of sink a few points into it after you select your primary Cabalistic ritual or two. And that pretty much wraps up the Cabbalistic rituals. As you can see, they're mostly a set of utility abilities that interact with your psychic powers one way or another, and in many cases help you be a much stronger and more potent psychic army. This definitely does make the Thousand Sons a lot more capable of utilizing their psychic powers in comparison to other armies. However, there's one other set of special rules that I want to cover in this video. That set of special rules being the Legion commands. The Legion commands are similar to abilities we've seen in other codexes, such as the upgrades that you have in Adeptus Mechanicus known as Holy Orders, Deadly Pathogens in the Death Guard Codex, Arcana and Necrons, and Blessings in the Sisters of Battle. However, obviously these have a specific Thousand Sons spin and interact with the Thousand Sons in different ways than those abilities do in their respective codexes. Like all of these special upgrades, these can only be given to specific models, cost army points to utilize, and increase the power level of the unit when power level is concerned. Each of these special upgrades is only usable once, and each of the models that are eligible for this upgrade are only allowed to have one of these upgrades, so you cannot stack these different abilities. So let's take a look at the different Legion commands that the Thousand Sons have access to. To begin with, the first 3 Legion commands are offered to the Exalted Sorcerer if you have one within your army. The first of these and the most expensive one is known as Dilettante, and it is 35 points. This is a very impressive ability, though it is kind of questionable considering the high points cost. What the Dilettante ability does is it allows you to take an additional relic on the character with this Legion command, and they are able to have a second relic in addition to the normal relic that they might possess. And the reason this is such an interesting ability is because normally you are not given the option to stack 2 relics on a single character, though there are some situations where you are allowed to do this. However, the other interesting thing about this is that in the majority of cases, an ability like this would cost command points and not army points when building an army. As such, this actually has 2 very interesting implications, though the power level of this is very dependent on the different relics that the Thousand Sons have access to, as well as how much you want this on an Exalted Sorcerer. So it's definitely a restrictive ability. However, it is one that does let you have extra relics by spending points instead of spending command points. Though do keep in mind the Thousand Sons can be a little bit of a points-hungry army, so it does bring into question of how useful this is, especially since the Thousand Sons generally don't have as much difficulty with command points as they will with points in some cases. Moving on from that, the second ability is called Radi, and it is 25 points. This ability says that the possessing Exalted Sorcerer can attempt to manifest 1 additional psychic power in your psychic phase. Do remember that the Exalted Sorcerer can manifest 2 psychic powers normally and knows 2 psychic powers plus might, so it really comes down to how much you value that additional psychic power, and in most cases I think you have enough psychic powers within your army that this is one of those abilities that you can kind of leave off. However, there might be some situations where you do find this useful, but at 25 points I think you'll usually find some better application for this, as to some extent it is a little bit redundant considering how much psychic power your Thousand Sons army already has. The third and last upgrade that the Exalted Sorcerer can take from the Legion commands is a 15-point upgrade that is called Paradigm of Change. What Paradigm of Change does is adds +1 wound to the model and 1 attack characteristic. This brings up the Exalted Sorcerer to 6 attacks and 6 wounds, with a 2+ weapon skill. This actually makes him a rather impressive force to be reckoned with, and can be very interesting, especially at the low points value. I think if you have points left over at the time you're building your list, this is definitely a decent enough option to include within your army, though once again it's just a little bit of extra stats, and it's not necessarily something that will make or break how your Exalted Sorcerer plays. However, I should mention that abilities like this are either warlord traits or relics for other armies, so it's definitely a powerful enough ability considering the restrictions placed on it. Now moving on to Legion commands, the Sorcerer or Sorcerer and Terminator armor has access to 3 different upgrades as well. The first of these upgrades is a 15-point upgrade, which is known as Loyal Thrall. This upgrade says that the model bearing this Legion command can attempt a psychic action within the psychic phase by foregoing one of its manifestations of psychic power instead of all of them. Normally, a sorcerer or sorcerer in Terminator armor has the ability to manifest 2 psychic powers, so you are down to half strength. Once again, this doesn't seem like the most important ability, though it can be useful in some cases where you want to use a psychic action and then manifest a psychic power. Though I do think you're generally going to have enough ability to manifest psychic powers that this isn't they'll necessarily make or break how you play Thousand Suns. And do remember that you're probably going to be favoring a MSU style build, so you are going to have a lot of different units that can perform different actions, so this isn't necessarily going to be something that you're going to be struggling to find within your list as it normally is already. The second Legion command is another 15-point Legion command that is known as Witch Warrior. And this Legion command says anytime this model uses a Smite or Witchfire power to generate a random number of mortal wounds, you can reroll one of the dice that is used to determine the number of mortal wounds generated by the psychic power. This, once again, is definitely a decent enough ability, though it is a little bit limited in terms of how much benefit it can provide. However, I will say this much, if you have the additional 15 points at the end of list building, this is something you can look at and consider considering the low points cost of this Legion command and the ability to give yourself a little more mileage off of some of those psychic powers that generate mortal wounds. Finally, the last Legion command that the regular sorcerer has access to is a 10-point Legion command known as Battle Psyker. Battle Psyker says that you change the weapon skill and ballistic skill of the bearer of this Legion command to 2+, and you change the attack profile to 5. This essentially adds +1 to each of these statistics on the sorcerer or sorcerer in Terminator armor, so it's not the most impressive thing in the world, but it does give him a little bit of extra mileage, and once again, it's a rather low points cost ability, so it's a decent enough filler when you need to burn a few extra points when building your army list, and it's definitely something that can come into play in some situations. And once again, it's definitely one of those abilities that would normally be a Warlord trait or something of that nature, so it does have some power level in that regard. The last 3 Legion commands can be given to an aspiring sorcerer within a unit of Thousand Suns Space Marines or a Scarab Occult sorcerer within a unit of Scarab Occult Terminators. And the first of these last 3 Legion commands is the Ardent Automata, and this will cost you a total of 20 points. And what it does is it allows the model's unit to shoot while performing an action without failing that action. This can actually be a rather powerful ability, and many armies usually like having access to an ability such as this. However, 20 points can be a little bit expensive, and do remember that the Thousand Suns do prefer that MSU style of gameplay, so it does lose a little bit of viability in that sense. And in addition to that, there is the issue that you do assign this to a single unit, more specifically a single model, so there isn't much ability to transfer this to different squads as there might be within other armies. That being said, there are going to be situations where if you're building a list that uses squads with larger model counts within the Thousand Suns, this can definitely be an option to allow you to hold a position, perform an action, and still fire with that larger squad without failing that action, which can be a rather powerful ability. So while this isn't necessarily something that's powerful at the moment, this is something that can be very powerful down the line depending on how the Thousand Suns army evolves as the meta goes on. The second Legion command is a 15-point one that is called Rites of Coalescence. Rites of Coalescence says, in your command phase, another model in this unit regains all of its lost wounds. Considering that the Thousand Suns Marines have 2 wounds each and the Terminators have 3 wounds each, there is some utility for this ability. However, do keep in mind that it specifically calls out one other model and not all models within that squad. And this means that essentially, at most, you're ever going to be regaining 1 to 2 wounds within any given turn. So this is a bit of a weak ability for a 15-point cost. I really think this is a bit of an afterthought, and I don't think this is something that's particularly impressive, so in most cases, I would say this is something you can forgo. Also, do keep in mind that in many armies, such as the Adeptus Mechanicus, each of their tech priests can heal D3 wounds off of different targets for free without using any points or command points to utilize that effect, so this is definitely even weaker in that regard, considering you need a wounded model in a specific squad to gain any benefit from this ability. And that's a rather big thing to ask, especially considering if your opponent's shooting at a squad, they're probably going to try to take out that squad entirely and not just take out a couple wounds and leave the Terminator alive. In addition to that, your opponent can control to some extent how they allocate their damage to ensure that you get minimal benefit from this ability, considering that if they know they can't deal the full amount of wounds to a model within that unit, they're probably going to target a different unit as opposed to potentially giving you the value off this ability. There might be some benefit to scaring off your opponent from shooting at that unit and not taking out a model that they might otherwise have taken out, but that is going to be such a fringe situation that I really think there are just going to be better options for those last 15 points than this specific Legion command. And the final Legion command for the squad leaders, as well as the final Legion command in general, is the Protege Legion command, which will cost you a total of 10 points. This Legion command says that the model bearing it knows 1 additional psychic power from its specific psychic discipline. This isn't a bad filler in some situations, but once again, you're going to have so many different units that know different psychic powers that it really does make you wonder how useful this is going to be. But as a points filler, once again, it's not the worst thing in the world, though I definitely take a look at some of the different options before going with this one. However, this can definitely open up some options that you might not otherwise have, depending on how you build out your army. And with that being said, hopefully this gave you some insight into the different special rules that the Thousand Sons have and how they benefit them being a psychic army. I definitely think the Cabbalistic rituals are incredibly interesting considering how they play and how they affect their list building. The Legion commands, on the other hand, do leave something to be desired, though it's definitely something nice to consider and play around with once in a while. So if you made it this far into the video, what do you guys think about the Cabbalistic rituals and Legion commands in specific? Does anything stand out that you think I might have missed, or do either of these special rules make you excited to play the army? There's also the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, but that's a rather set of basic abilities, though if that's what gets you excited, do let me know in the comments down below as well. Anyway, in the next video of this series, we're going to be taking a look at the different sorcerer cults that are available to the Thousand Sons. In any case, thank you for watching, and if you know anyone who may benefit from this content, please do share, as it really does help the channel out, as well as those who may benefit from the content. As always, I want to give a big thank you to my patrons. You're all awesome people, and as always, have a great day. Bye.